Perhaps I should say a few things about the title first and why I thought about this title. If you were to look at chemical engineering in its simplest terms, at least this is how it started in the past, it was all about, or mainly about the transfer, if you like, of the laboratory chemistry to the process scale. But of course, things have moved since then, and nowadays I think it would be fair to say, at least for me, that this discipline is mostly about an amalgamation of different disciplines like mathematics, chemistry, more recently biology, and also physics. I mention physics because often, especially when you talk to people from the funding bodies, they talk about the interface between chemistry and chemical engineering, but they leave physics out, and I will try to show here that physics is important. I should also point out that why this mixture of these different disciplines, I think, is possible is precisely because I personally think that chemical engineers are in a good position to embark on interdisciplinary projects, not just in collaboration, but also on their own. And I will be trying to demonstrate some of this, at least, I hope I can try to demonstrate or to show you some of this, at least in part, through an overview of past and present work. So what I thought of doing, speaking of an overview, because of time limitations, I had to go for a selected number of problems. And what I'm going to try to do is, after the overview, go into some technical details with a particular problem, okay? And then I'm going to close with some future work. Oh, I brought a mouse here for this purpose, okay. So the first group of problems that I would like to discuss is pattern formation driven by coupled hydrodynamic and reaction diffusion instabilities. This is work done with friends and collaborators Ande Witt from Brussels and Desu Horvath and Agotatov from Hungary. Here we're talking about hydrodynamic deformations between reactive fluids, okay? This appears in a wide variety of systems of chemical engineering interest. But of course, as you start adding various complexities like density variations and also heat effects, as we will see here, the resulting pattern formation dynamics becomes quite complicated, so it makes sense to try to look, at least from the fundamental point of view, for the simplest possible model systems which retain the elementary characteristics, dynamic characteristics, if you like, of the full system. And in fact, this will be the main point of this talk, that we always look for the simplest possible systems. So what we do here, this is a prototype. We have the simplest possible porous medium, which is a Hilly-Shaw cell. This consists of two parallel plates with a thin gap in between, oriented vertically in the direction of gravity. And this is filled with the this is filled with the reactants of a chloride tetrathionate reaction, okay? And if we don't worry about the exothermicity of the reaction for the time being, it turns out that the products of this reaction are in fact heavier than the reactants. Where the products come from, if you trigger the reaction at the top, so you get a front that will actually invade the reactants, and it will leave the products of the reaction behind, okay? And if you trigger it from the bottom, then the front moves upwards and leaves the products behind. Now, if the products are heavier than the reactants, this is Rayleigh-Taylor unstable, yes? Because it's an unfavorable density stratification. But on the other hand, as it turns out, if you include the reaction exothermicity, you can make the products lighter than the reactants, and you can have this front to be stable. Okay, some of the things that we have done here. The main point is the Darcy-Boussinesq equations. Darcy's law is the simplest prototype for flow in a Hilly-Shaw cell. In the Boussinesq approximation, density is a linear function of density, of concentration and temperature. So we looked at the complex interplay between hydrodynamics, reaction, and there is this curious effect, a double diffusive convection. This has to do with differential diffusivity of heat and mass. And in fact, the same phenomenon appears in seawater when you have, let's say, hot saline water on top of cold fresh water. Because heat diffuses faster than salt, you quickly end up with cold saline water on top of cold fresh water, which is an unstable configuration. What we find is that for ascending fronts, we have Rayleigh-Taylor type dispersion curves and therefore thermal plumes. For descending fronts, we have Turing type dispersion curves and stationary patterns. A Turing pattern is a pattern with a which any stationary spatially periodic cellular structure is a Turing pattern. Those of you who know a little bit about the history of the Second World War, you know that Turing was the guy who in fact helped break the Enigma code. Yes, device to device that broke the Enigma code. Okay, so let me show you the experiments by Desu and Nagota. This is the downwards propagating front. You can see here the Turing pattern, a small amplitude Turing pattern. This is the ascending front. You can just about see these thermal plumes I was talking about. These are dispersion curves computed and experimental predictions here. Now this one, this is unstable, the light. This one here is a typical Rayleigh-Taylor a long wave variety instability, and this one is a Turing type dispersion curve. Cross and Hochberg call this the type 1 dispersion curve, because it has a band of unstable modes between two neutral wave numbers away from the zero wave number. Okay? Of course, if you have a type 1 curve, it does not mean that the pattern will saturate in the nonlinear stage. This is a nonlinear question, okay, whether you go to stationary norm solution or not, but it turns out that this is indeed the case. There is an analogy here with the Blasius boundary layer, which I think it has this type of dispersion curve, but in fact the solution does not saturate. So these are some computations here. We can just about see the small amplitude Turing pattern, and because the product indicated here with white is in fact lighter than the reactant, as the product invades the reactant, which is indicated with black, we have this thermal plume. So this is sort of like a journey through some of the problems that we have looked at, which I think are interesting. This is another prototype, so we switch slightly thin here, so we have an horizontal thin film, so nothing happens to it, unless we introduce something like reactive surfactants, and we chose to model this with a prototype, the Fitzhugh-Nakumo equation, which comes from the biological field. This is a prototype used to model, if you like, propagation of action potential through nerve cells. And it has two properties. It can either be in the bistable regime. By bistability, we mean that we have two states which are stable, but one is less stable than the other, so you can have a front that actually invades the less stable state. By excitability, we mean that any small but finite amplitude disturbance can actually cause the system to be driven away from the originally spatially uniform state. In the simplest possible case, this equation is a two-variable system. For the activator, let's call it zeta, and the inhibitor, let's call it xi. And the names simply mean that the activator enhances the concentration of both species, while the inhibitor lowers the concentration of both species. And the coupling through the film here is done by assuming that, let's say, the inhibitor acts as a surfactant. Okay, so why this is an interesting system? First of all, it's a system that has a full feedback mechanism. For example, if you change the reaction rate, what you do is you change the surfactant concentration. Therefore, you change the rate by which F station changes due to surfactants. Hence, you affect the interface, and hence you alter the rate of reaction. So you close the loop. Biological systems, in fact, have often this feedback mechanism, and this typically leads to self-organization phenomena. Now, interestingly, there are situations where neither hydrodynamically nor chemically, when you take them separately, there is an instability, but because of the coupling, and because the two subsystems have widely different separated time scales, there can be a destabilization. So let me show you some of the interesting phenomena that one sees here. So this is a decoupled system, so nothing happens to the film, but zeta, the concentration, undergoes a Turing bifurcation, and eventually we have the spatially periodic cellular structure. Incidentally, Turing has written a very nice paper on the basis of morphogenesis, how zebras, for example, get their spots, yes? The mechanism by which this happens. On the other hand, if you couple the two systems, at the start you see a small amplitude, a spatially stationary, periodic stationary structure, but eventually as time proceeds, what you have is the emergence of a time oscillation, which coupled with a space oscillation due to Turing, you see this breather-like pattern. Yes? Okay. Now, when both systems are stable, okay, you couple them, there exists a critical value of some parameter here, we refer to as a Marangoni number, above which there is at the start a typical Turing type bifurcation, that is, again, the solution grows monotonically in time without any lateral displacement. But as time proceeds, we have the emergence of various fronts which continuously coalesce with each other, yes? These are, in fact, deeply inelastic coalescence events. The fronts annihilate each other, and new fronts are formed, and so on, and then the pattern will actually never saturate. And this is an interesting phenomenon here. A front, a reaction diffusion front causes a negative pulse wave. The reason why we have two fronts here is because of the reflection symmetry in this direction. Anytime there is a front propagating downstream, we have a counter-propagating upstream front with the same velocity. Let me now switch off the flow. Interesting effects happen here, and this is some work. So we went from something that has flow to something that has no flow. This is some interesting work we did with John Merkin and Steve Scott from the University of Leeds. Some of you, if you have done a reaction diffusion system, you might know the great Scott model. It was the answer, if you like, of the UK to the Brussellator model developed in Brussels. Okay, and so what we have here is the simplest possible version of the Fitts-Hugh-Nagumo equation. Is the pi-stable reaction diffusion equation. This one has a kinetic term, which is cubic, and we switch it off preferentially in regions of no excitability. Okay, we refer to these regions as gaps in an otherwise excitable medium. I don't have a board to sketch this, but what really happens if you just have one gap in the excitability domain, as a front approaches this gap, propagation in the gap takes place through simple diffusion until on the other side of the gap the concentration of the species increases. It reaches a certain threshold. This is excitability. We are above this threshold, and then you can ignite the wave on the other side. Okay? However, if this block is sufficiently long, then you cannot pass. This is similarly to, let's say, you have a fire and you try to stop it with a wall. If the wall is very long, then the fire cannot get through. Okay. No, but this is the single gap case. Two and more gaps are more complicated. For example, this is one gap and another gap here. The width is less than WC, the critical gap width in the single gap case. But the two gaps are not widely separated, so they can see each other, they in fact interact, and they manage to block the wave. However, here, if the separation distance is sufficiently large, this is 0.69, this is 0.66, the wave can actually get through. So this is a complicated system to understand. Why? In fact, there are some interesting applications for mathematical biology here. For example, in the demyelination of nerve fibers, because of various diseases of central nervous system, the loss of myelin, okay, can often slow down or even block the propagation of nerve of action potentials. Or in the propagation of electric excitation of the heart tissue, you encounter regions of depressed excitability. So there was a need to try to understand what is happening. We have a sophisticated geometric method here to develop conditions for successful propagation failure. This was a paper in Science Journal of Applied Maths. These are various technicalities. I don't want to talk about them, so we don't worry about them. We did some stability analysis, asymptotic analysis, for example, high activation energy asymptotics. Those of you who know about theoretical combustion, you might have come across the work of Buckmaster. He did a lot of these. And if you try to publish in this area, you have to cite his work, because all the reference comments will tell you you need to cite Buckmaster. Also, we looked at chaotic flows and how chaotic flows affect reaction filaments and reaction efficiency. To prove to you that we have done some of this work, we have published it, and this is not just I'm talking about. Of course, this is not a proof because our name is not here, so it could be anything. But this is, this is in fact what we call a bifurcation diagram. So this is a Lewis number here of a non-adiabatic combustion front as a function of a parameter gamma. This is a dimensionless heat loss. And this is a small parameter epsilon, which is inversely proportional to, if you like, an activation energy. The solid lines are bifurcation diagrams. This is some jargon from dynamical systems theory. The dashed lines are asymptotic. So this is pen and paper. So interestingly, you can actually capture the topological transition here, where the two curves, the saddle node and the Hopf curve, merge at what people call in dynamical systems a Takens-Bogdanov point. Yes, you basically have a double zero singularity there. So this is interesting to just see what you can do, in fact, with small parameter asymptotics analysis. Okay, I have been talking about waves, so I'm going to move now to waves on a falling film. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that waves have fascinated humans since the beginning of civilization, and often they have stimulated new branches of mathematics, like inverse scattering theory for invisible deep water waves. And yet there is a different type of waves, like waves on a falling film, which in fact are much more interesting and rich than any other systems. Okay. And they have only been scrutinized for the last 50 or 60 years or so. Now, what is special about the falling film is because of the conservation of mass and because of viscosity, you don't have the energy conserved deep water waves, for example, and therefore techniques like inverse scattering are not applicable. But still one can do something quantitatively in the sense that we have elementary structures, coherent structures like solitary pulses, yes? Which seem to dominate the dynamics. And this is at the root of this quantitative description. This is a picture of such solitary pulses. I mean, they're curved in the transverse direction here. But this, in fact, is a picture taken by Christian Ruerkil, a good friend and collaborator from Paris, on a rainy day in Orsay. Orsay is a place, I think, at the south of France, yes? And this is a rather sloppy street. I know because I spent some time there. I used to walk up and down. When you walk down, you can utilize the gravitational field, but walking up is quite an achievement. It's an interesting historical aspect here on how this problem was first investigated. Okay, so this is a letter that was written by Kapitsa sometime in the 40s from his house outside Moscow to a friend of his who was a biologist. Kapitsa did not believe in biology, yes, so don't get offended here. But what happened, in fact, after the war, he was asked, while you read the letter, I will just tell you a little bit about the story. After the war, he was asked to work on a nuclear weapon project under Beria, and he refused. So he was fired from his position as director of physical problems, and he was confined under house arrest in his house outside Moscow. And that's when he did some pioneering experiments with a very simple apparatus in his kitchen, with his help of his friend, of his son Sergei. His son Sergei was not as bright as his father. I think he went on to work on the TV, if I'm not mistaken. But let's just look at the last sentence, which is a very interesting one by Kapitsa. He says, I succeeded in observing and studying this type of wave law and confirming my theory. Interestingly, the theory was incorrect, and the interpretation of his own experiments was incorrect. So this is a nice example where agreement between theory and experiments cannot be used, in fact, to justify neither of the two. If Benjamin was here, maybe it's a good thing that he's not here, he would tell us with a paper in 1957 how, in fact, corrected at least the linear theory of Kapitsa. Of course, for Kapitsa, that was just his, if you like, hobby in his house. His main occupation was low-temperature physics, and later on, in the 70s, he won the Nobel Prize for his work on helium superfluidity. This is a nice computation by Mark Pradas. Here, we're looking at the two-dimension, by 2D, I mean 1 + 1 dimension. One dimension is, if you like, streamwise, and the height is the second dimension. We are in a frame of reference moving with these solitary pulses here, so they're practically frozen. So this wave packet travels upstream, and you can see that these pulses are, in fact, born out of this wave packet, yes? This is our own experiment. Believe it or not, this is our own experiment. Just to show you that we have done some experiments. This is the final stage of the evolution of falling film, several transitions and so on. So we have this kind of chaotic three-dimensional wave regime. For water on a vertical plane, the Reynolds number is 60. At point 1, we see a 2D soliton. You see here the cinematography is very basic, yes? A 2D soliton with a 3D modulation in this direction. At 2, we have a couple well-developed 3D solitons interacting through their tails, and here we have a complex coalescence event involving various solitons. I'm going to try to focus at 1 and 2. So no matter what happens in the system, we can always identify these localized coherent structures, these 3D waves, in what appears to be a randomly disturbed surface. So in other words, these structures are elementary processes, or perhaps the dynamics of the system could be described as their superposition. I'll come back to this point in a second. But because of the effect that these structures seem to dominate, they seem to organize the flow, these dissipative structures, we have an example of weak or dissipative interfacial turbulence. This is, in fact, a term that was introduced by Paul Manville. Okay. If we use a basic model, not as sophisticated as the models that Christian has developed recently with Paul Manville, we get the velocity of these pulses as a function of delta. It's a generalized Reynolds number. This contains the user Reynolds number plus a Kapitsa number, which is a function of the physical properties only. And then we can look at what happens to the shape of these waves as we change delta. So you can see here we have kind of a generic shape in which there is a gentle sloping back edge, yes, followed by a steep front edge and these small capillary bow waves at the front. Because we would like to see what is the Reynolds number at which we have the transition to the 3D instability, we can subject the structures to an instability, to the stability analysis in the transverse direction, linear. And this actually does show that there is a destabilization, but unfortunately you find that this in fact persists for all Reynolds numbers, but our experiments, and more recent ones by Parker and Ozokun published in the ISHG journal, indicate clearly a critical Reynolds number. So for people who are into weakly nonlinear analysis, this is in fact an easy question, because you expect a supercritical bifurcation, hence the possibility of saturating the amplitude of the disturbance, hence which corresponds to negative Landau constant. Yeah, but you can answer the same question via computations. The top row here shows a 2D pulse with some random noise. For delta less than a critical value, we find 0.048, above which you have a modulation with a wavelength predicted by linear analysis, but somehow nonlinearity suppress the initial linear growth. For delta larger than 0.048, this modulation grows unarrested, and then you get this 3D pulse from above, we see it here, and 2 small bits here from 2 trailing pulses. Notice now what happens if you have a periodic train of pulses, that is, they're sufficiently close to each other, so they can in fact interact by exchanging mass between neighboring structures. Eventually you get this kind of Herring-Bontai pattern. It's a mixture of streamwise growing perturbations with span-wise phase perturbations, okay? In some sense, this is reminiscent of the Benjamin-Fair instability, which was first suggested for systems without energy supply or dissipation, unlike the case here. Let me show you how some of these structures look like. Incidentally, because if you look at them from the top, they resemble the Greek letter lambda, so we refer to them as lambda solitons, yes? Delta increases from left to right and top to bottom. So you have typically this large curvature head, yes, with capillary ripples at the front, 2 oblique legs at the back, and a dent due to capillary depression between the legs. Just to show you that there is good agreement with theory and experiments, so this is experimental shadow images, our own experiments for 2 different values of the Reynolds number, and these are in fact theoretical, computation results. Agreement is good. And this is in fact a nice image, not surprisingly that it was selected for a physical review kaleidoscope. Now this is what happens if you have a lambda structure interacting with a localized signal of smaller amplitude at the front, okay? That is a small drop. Eventually you get this nice, effectively V-shape, a staggered checkerboard pattern, which is actually observed often in falling film experiments with 2 trailing solitons literally sitting at the legs of the primary one. We'll come back to this second shortly. One point I would like, there is a lot of technicalities here, which perhaps I should not have included. 2 points I would like to mention. Linear analysis reveals some technical difficulties with discrete essential spectrum. This is rather technical. And we have looked at the inclusion of additional effects and complexities, for example, Marangoni effects, and with Christian at the problem of a film coating and vertical fiber. That you will also see shortly. Some of our publications, no need to go through them on this problem. I hope first, they are different from each other, and second, they have nothing to say. Okay, but then we were gradually moving towards simpler prototypes. The question is, are there any simple model PDs which we can actually use, for example, for the falling film problem or otherwise? Yes, there is. This is the 3D. Now we have 2 spatial dimensions, streamwise cross-stream and height, i.e. 2 + 1, so-called generalized, we call it generalized Kuramoto-Sivansikii or GKS equation. Because it contains the fundamental elements of any process that involves wave evolution, yes, that is, you have dispersion, dissipation, there is a simple nonlinearity, and active means instability, this prototype, in fact, is a model for pattern formation dynamics and spatio-temporal complexity. If you look at the literature, it appears in various physical phenomena, from plasma physics all the way to, let's say, magma waves in magma segregation in the Earth's mantle. You can derive it asymptotically, rigorously, for the falling film by assuming strong surface tension and near critical conditions. And it's an extension to 3D of the 2D GKS equation. The 2D GKS equation was scrutinized by Kavahar and co-workers in a physics of fluids paper. I'm saying this to show that physics of fluids does not only publish papers related to fluid mechanics. So remember the concept of wave superposition, yes? We utilize, in fact, this is not a new concept. Coherent structures theory originates from particle physics, where one tries to understand particle-particle interaction in condensed matter theory. So if the particles are sufficiently far from each other, we have weak interaction and so on. So we try to utilize this concept here for the GKS equation, i.e., we look at the superposition of pulses, and we try to derive a dynamical system for the location of each pulse. Of particular interest is the formation of the so-called bound states, that is, states consisting of 2 or more pulses which travel happily together as a whole. Yes? In fact, it turns out this is relevant to a problem that we have actually analyzed with Christian's group in Paris. This is the film coating of vertical fiber. In fact, the experiments are done in Paris. So what you have here is a reservoir of liquid, very viscous liquid, that coats, flows down due to gravity and coats this fiber. In fact, the fiber is stretched with this weight here, fishing line, yes? And as it coats the fiber, it breaks up spontaneously into drop-like pulses because of the Rayleigh plateau instability. Some interesting digression here, and this is in fact due to Christian's very deep insight on this problem. If you look sufficiently close for sufficiently small flow rates and you look sufficiently close to the inlet, what you see here, a regular primary wave train, not surprising because the power spectrum here is actually, this experiment, yes, it's actually quite narrow. But also if you decrease the flow rate or if you play a little bit with the Faber radius, you will see that even further downstream you have a regular train of nonlinear waves with the same separation distance, the same amplitude and speed. So this is something that people in absolute instabilities call a nonlinear global mode. There is a nice paper by Somaz where you can read this. And therefore we have an absolutely unstable system. If you now increase the flow rate, the primary wave train is quite irregular, as indicated here by this broad power spectrum, and as a result, we have a convectively unstable system. Nice figure also, not surprisingly, it appeared as a cover in Physical Review letters. Okay. So, if we now track the world lines of the peaks of these drop-like solitary pulses experimentally, and these world lines are shown here, it turns out that the quasi-irregular, if you like, original train of drop-like pulses at the very start, up to about 80 centimeters, so this graph here is up to 1 meter, up to about 1 meter, 80 centimeters, let's say, it is continuously destabilized by numerous coalescence events, as you can see here. Interestingly, after about 80 centimeters, as is the case here, no more coalescence occurs, and it seems that the pulses now rearrange themselves only through attractions and repulsions. Okay? This is an attraction event in A, this is a repulsion event in B. It's shown more clearly here, this is attraction, this is repulsion. As far as attraction is concerned, what happens is that the upstream pulse seems to accelerate to catch up with downstream pulse. The downstream pulse seems to decelerate so that the upstream can catch up until a certain distance where they lock themselves into bound state and they happily travel downstream. Despite this, if you look at the overall system, it's quite disorganized, okay? So there's no organization. But still, if you do a careful statistical analysis of a large ensemble average, okay, you find well-selected separation distances, most probable or preferred, if you like, distance. So there is, after all, some organization. And there is qualitative agreement between what we see here and the GKS equation. In fact, these world lines for the spatio-temporal dynamics of the GKS equation are more or less what you see in the experiments, and these peaks are in qualitative agreement with the separation distance that you see in the experiments. Qualitative agreement because we use a very simple prototype. Moreover, these peaks here are in perfect agreement with the interaction map that is predicted by the theory. This here is the theoretical result. Okay, so we have alternating stable with a field circle and unstable with the cross states. And if you look at the 9.5 here, 14 and 18.5, they correspond precisely to these peaks, 9.5, 14 and 18.5. This one we exclude because the overlap between the two solitons is very strong, and therefore the theory is invalidated because we assumed well-separated structures. Extending the concept of coherent structures to 3D shows the V-shape that we had seen earlier, but for the falling film problem. And what we have here now is a bound state of 3 structures which actually travel from somewhere up here, down here, with the same amplitude and speed. Okay? Now, interestingly, that's a small digression. The same type of V-shape appears in nature. For example, these are Canadian geese and any other migratory birds. But of course, the mechanism here is different. People... Moreover, unlike our solitons, which in fact here, yes, unlike our solitons which can actually travel without any fatigue, the front bird here eventually gets tired and naturally drops back and another one comes to replace it. But the front one in fact creates lift for the 2 birds to assist in the flight. Okay. We can then move naturally from deterministic model PDEs to stochastic ones. After all, noise in nature appears, if you like, is ubiquitous and also in technological systems. This is work we did with Greg Pavliotis and Dimitrios Papageorgiou from mathematics. So we have here a forced KS equation. The noise is additive, that is, it does not depend on the state of the system, okay? And sigma denotes the strength of noise. A here is the amplitude of a dominant unstable mode. We assume, so we can do some analysis that the domain is sufficiently small so that there is one single unstable mode. And there is a second stable mode behind it, yes? This probability density function here of the amplitude A is actually denoted here. And what you see as you increase the strength of the noise sigma, you go through this state where you have continuous fluctuations through to a state of an on-off intermittency with a waiting time between subsequent bursts where the solution is stabilized, and eventually for sufficient large times the solution is completely stabilized. This is very interesting because if you look at the probability density function of this waiting time t, it scales nicely with an exponent -3/2. This is consistent with the Gisbert-Landau model for the system close to criticality. And Mark has done some nice analysis, Mark Pradas, to actually obtain analytically this 3/2 exponent by utilizing the first passes properties of the random walk. Amazingly, if you look at the literature, this 3/2 exponent appears in various phenomena, earthquakes, as Greg has pointed out, we have found in physiology, and so on. So we would like to investigate this a bit more. I mentioned here there are a few things which I would like to say. For example, okay, we mentioned the fiber problem. We have recently extended the GKS coherent structure theory to the falling film problem by using the so-called second-order model by Christian Ruirkiel and Manville. This is the only model that, in fact, includes second-order viscous diffusion effects, neglected in all other studies. In the interaction problem, they are crucial because they affect the amplitude and oscillation of the capillary ripples in front of the pulses and hence the separation distances. Okay? I mentioned the critical on-off intermittency for noisy media. In fact, by using the multi-scale methodology for stochastic PDs that was developed by Greg in our system, and the reason why we can actually do here is because we have a slow dominant mode followed by a stable fast mode, which is slave to the dominant one, we can actually analyze the system. So we find the critical exponents of both the K.S. and Burgess equations. We have done also the Burgess equation. And amazingly, they have the same critical exponents, okay, i.e. they belong to the same universality class. So this, we believe, is some kind of at least partial proof of the so-called Yakut conjecture in theoretical physics. Okay. Now, because there might be some technical, and I'm sure there are some technical people in the audience, including myself, I'm going to try to do some technical details, okay? So you have to bear with me with this. I will just introduce some equations instead of talking about them. Now, the problem we would like to do, and this was done also in collaboration with Greg, and Nico Sava drove this project, is the problem of contact line motion over topography. And we do that by actually using, as a simple prototype, a toy model that has been used often in wetting hydrodynamics, and this is droplet spreading over topography. Now, the motivation for this is the fact that actual surfaces are not, in fact, ideally smooth, but they have various random defects, which are due, in fact, to either natural or artificial processes, okay? And this is nicely illustrated in these scanning electron microscopy images by Hitchcock et al. This is work done, in fact, at Harwell, yes, which is close to where I live. This is in Oxfordshire, yes. So there are two things that you notice from this. First, I should point out that these curves are cuts on different directions of these images, okay? And then by doing Fourier analysis of these curves, you can actually extract ranges of characteristic amplitudes and wavelengths, okay? Two things to notice here. First, as the range of wavelengths increases, okay, the complexity of this image increases, as one might expect. Second, and this is more important for us, the amplitude of these structures seems to be always smaller than the characteristic wavelength. So we can exploit this for asymptotic analysis. But because we talk about droplets over topographical substrate, a distinction needs to be made as we zoom progressively into a contact line region. For example, if you are, let's say, what you would see in a naked eye in the laboratory at a length scale of about 1 millimeter is the apparent or macroscopic contact angle. But as you progressively zoom into this region and you start resolving these heterogeneities, okay, at a length scale of about I think it's 1 micron, you would see another contact angle, which is a mesoscopic one, and eventually going down to the nanoscale at the order of about nanometer, you would see the apparent contact angle alpha S, we call it alpha S here. Not surprisingly, at this small scale, the topography appears to be locally flat, okay? So this angle is taken to be constant, while theta, of course, and theta up vary dynamically. Now, there is here, of course, in this problem, there is a kinematic discontinuity associated with the fact that this point on the interface has to move, and at the same time, it has to satisfy no slip condition. For the time being, what I'm going to do, and I will come back to this point at the end when I discuss future work, we'll just resolve this discontinuity with a simple slip model. So let me just do that. So we have slip there, yes, an obvious slip type model. So this is the governing dimensionless PDE, okay? This comes from a long wave expansion in the Stokes flow regime. So eta here is a variable that measures the topography shape with respect to the atom level. H here is a deviation height, and lambda is a dimensional slip coefficient. These are the two zero height conditions. These are the conditions of slopes at these 2 points. Effectively, these are geometric conditions imposing the fact that the interface has to come down with angle AS with respect to the substrate. This is a volume constraint where this factor of 2 comes from the choice of length scale. What we have done here is to generalize the work by Hawking. This is a very nice paper for flat substrates to topographical ones. So we have an inner region of order lambda. So I'm using here some terminology from singular perturbation theory. And then there is an outer region where effectively the slip is in fact not important, but capillarity dominates. And through matched asymptotics here in an overlap domain somewhere here, we can actually obtain two equations. These are integral differential equations for the spreading rates. So these functions here contain integrals of these quantities. There are some technicalities here about this overlap region, which we have actually discussed in this physics of fluids paper with Nikos. So we can now solve these equations and also solve the full PDE, and Nikos has devised an ingenious scheme based on the Chebyshev discretization, which is appropriate for PDEs with solutions with sharply varying domains, okay? And we can see what happens. So what we see here, first of all, the solid line, this continuous solid line is the full PDE, and the dashed line is what we obtain asymptotically. The agreement between the two is quite good, okay? This blue line here corresponds, in fact, to the large time equilibrium for the flat substrate case. And what you see is that at least initially, the droplet appears to be spreading symmetrically, but as time progresses, you will notice in a second that the topography manifests itself, and what we have here effectively, at this point in particular, you will see is this tick slip event, yes, which is manifesting itself here through these staircase-like dynamics in this graph. Also, the final equilibrium, yes, at large times, is shifted compared to the flat substrate equilibrium. So we have a hysteresis-like effect. Let us now move to the, this is more technical, let us move to the topographical substrate case. There are two fundamental difficulties, well, several, in fact, fundamental difficulties that one encounters. One of the most serious one is that we have to have a substrate which, at least according to the experiments, must have sufficiently large frequency content, but at the same time has to be differentiable. So at the start we came up after some thinking with this trigonometric Fourier series, okay, where alpha m and beta m are statistically independent normal variables, okay, and n is taken large. Of course this is periodic, yes, because it's Fourier, but as it turns out, as n tends to infinity, you lose the periodicity. Because you lose the periodicity, this is good because you have then something which is more or less close to experiments. Moreover, as n tends to infinity, okay, this signal turns out it approaches something that is known as band-limited white noise. So it's got a spectral density, which is just a square, up to a cutoff wave number k0. But as k0 tends to infinity, you can also approach white noise, pure white noise. So at the same time, by using a theorem called Kolmogorov's continuity theorem, we can prove differentiability. We want differentiability because this enters the equation through its derivatives. Now, it turns out that we can analyze the system by introducing two new variables, L and epsilon. L is what we refer to as droplet shift. That is the maximum, the shift of the maximum of the droplet with respect to the flat substrate case, which is exactly at x equals 0, due to the topography. So L equals 0 for the flat case. X0 here is the flat substrate radius, okay? So epsilon, what we refer to as contact line fluctuation, is effectively the deviation from the flat substrate case radius due to the topography. And asymptotically, we can do something when this condition is satisfied. Epsilon is much smaller than x0, and this condition also is satisfied. Not surprisingly, what we find is that the statics alone cannot assess the wetting effects. Unfortunately, we have a nonlinear ODE for L which cannot be solved exactly, but it can be approximated. The solution can be approximated. It turns out it's not a normal variable as one might expect. But fortunately, we have a linear ODE for epsilon, and it turns out that epsilon is a normal variable as one might expect. Detailed statistical analysis can actually be used to obtain expressions for the variance of L. This is a variance because the mean of both L and epsilon is exactly 0. The variance of L and the variance of epsilon. And the variance of L scales like 1 over k0 square, while for epsilon it scales like eta naught square k0 square. Now this is an interesting plot because it plots the mean of epsilon normalized with eta naught as a function of the wave number of the substrate. And what you notice here, this is the solid line is theoretical prediction of this analysis, yes? Well, this is numerical experiments. As k0 increases, the frequency content of this substrate increases. We have a progressive drift towards negative values from mu epsilon. Hence, the apparent contact angle increases, and therefore the roughness seems to inhibit wetting as opposed to enhancing it, i.e. in direct contradiction of Wenzel law. Okay, so Wenzel law is a classical law, but in fact is not true. Okay. But we would like to have statistics which is independent practically from the substrate, that is from the spectral density of the substrate. If you talk to some material scientists, for example, they claim that substrates are more like fractal structures, of course with a cutoff. A fractal structure has a spectral density that decays with wave number. But you have an exponent which is proportional to the fractal dimension. Okay, and this is in fact Nikos' rather genius solution to this problem. He says, let's look again at the expression for epsilon. Km now is k0 m over n. S here of Km is the spectral density. We look at the condition that the droplet has to satisfy for equilibrium, but not just equilibrium will do, we just want the stable one. Okay, never mind the unstable, we just want the stable one. So this is the condition for the stable equilibrium. And he noticed that if we define this functional Q here, the derivative of Q is precisely the condition for equilibrium. The second derivative, positive, is precisely the condition for stability. Hence, the stable equilibrium maximizes Q. I will just leave it at that, but it turns out that this problem now can be mapped to something that people have studied in probability theory. I refer here to the work of Rice at Bell Laboratories in America. Yes? And also it allows us to redefine our length scales zeta naught and k naught. So we can have natural scales for this system. N max the number of substrate maxima per unit length, and n bar max the mean of substrate maxima. As a result, the variance of epsilon now is given by this expression, the mean by this. S sub c is the cutoff, the cutoff spectral density is the cutoff wave number. So this is a higher order correction anyway, so to Linnik order we have a dependence of SC. And this is a nice compact expression for something like the substrate roughness. It depends how you define it, but here it was defined as a ratio of the actual area over the projected area. Now I'm going to change things, and I'm going to take the substrate and incline it. In fact, this work was actually motivated by some fascinating experiments done in Bristol, here in the UK, yes, by, that was by Brunet and Eggers. And in fact, this example here attracted a lot of national press a few years ago. There was an article in The Guardian entitled "Physicists Make Water Run Uphill." What happens is if you have a droplet on an inclined plane and you start oscillating the substrate, the droplet can actually move uphill. Okay, it's curious. It's a curious effect. Let's talk about this. So we have, this is our equation now. W1 and W2 are two forcing terms because we oscillate. So we have naturally the frequency, the period of oscillation T, frequency of oscillation omega, a Born number and a Struhal number here. And this is a very curious problem because, as Nico noticed, if you have a droplet on an inclined, perfectly smooth substrate, yes, if it is perfectly smooth, it's a degenerate problem because the equation that governs the steady states is third order. You have one unknown, which is the length of this droplet, and 5 conditions. So you have 2 conditions here of 0 height, the fact that the slopes have to be alpha s at both ends, and a 5th condition, the volume. So one unknown. So it's an overdetermined system. But as you will see, if you put topography, this degeneracy is removed up to a certain point where one loses the steady solutions. Now this is a computation of an equilibrium attained on an inclined, non-vibrating and rough substrate. Here we also monitor the evolution of the droplet in the phase plane. Okay, so initially we have a nice spreading process. Okay. This is in fact a separatrix in a phase plane until the trajectory comes close to this sharp bend of the separatrix. This is accompanied by stick slip event, yes? Again, a staircase-like dynamics, and then the droplet stops. So now we're going on a flat, non-vibrating, horizontal substrate. Eta of x is initially 0. This is a measure of the droplet radius. This is a droplet shift, or if you like, the shift of the peak of the droplet compared to our coordinate system. And what you see here, the trajectories, eventually nothing special happens. They approach the flat substrate dimensionless radius, which is square root of 3 over 2. So nothing happens here. But we're going now to introduce topography. Still, we have an horizontal substrate, which is non-vibrating, okay? But this is now rough. And what you see now is that all of a sudden the phase plane became much more interesting. Okay, so we have a constellation of fixed points. These filled circles are stable nodes. The open circles are stable ones, and these are what we call saddle points. And the solid lines are in fact stable manifolds, and the dashed lines are unstable manifolds. And what we're going to do, if we can actually focus on these two stable points, the blue one and the red one, after we increase the inclination angle by 0.5 degrees at a time. So we're going to start increasing it by 0.5 degrees at a time. And what you see is that these stable nodes start across the saddle points and they eat them, yes, so they annihilate them. And in this process, okay, the phase plane becomes less dense. Okay, and you can actually follow this evolution here. It takes some time, okay. Up to an angle which is a critical one, yes, about 12.5 degrees, above which no more fixed points are observed, and therefore there is no steady solution, and the droplet is going to slide downstream. Okay. So interestingly, if you plot the difference between the two apparent contact angles at the front and back of the droplet as a function of phi, you find a linear behavior. And also we have this scaling argument for the sign of the critical angle in terms of the various parameters. Now this is a flat inclined substrate which is oscillating. The droplet now exhibits rather rapid oscillations, okay? But somehow it manages to climb up this substrate, as also indicated here by the fact that the droplet shift seems to be drifting slowly towards negative values. Hence we have a net motion which is upstream. We can actually obtain analytically criteria under which a droplet which is on a vibrating and flat substrate will actually climb. We have an equation of this form for L dot. For sufficiently small values of the forcing parameters, we simplify to this ODE. And now if we average this over a period of oscillation, we can get the speed V bar of the droplet. Okay? In the limit, the distinguished limit, when the Strouhal number is of the order of the square root of the Bohr number, this is simplified to a nice expression like that. Hence, when the numerator is negative, i.e. when this condition is satisfied, V bar is negative and the droplet moves up. In the general case, when V bar is 0, we have to trace this at the locus of V bar 0. In the general case, sorry, when we don't simplify the equation, we have to trace the locus of V bar equals 0 numerically, and we get these solution branches. So climbing here occurs below. In fact, you can do a detailed analysis, and this is a map in the Strouhal number inverse period of oscillation parameter space. So we have a sliding regime and a sliding regime intercepted by a climbing regime. Now this is an interesting case because the parameters are chosen so that the oscillation, the vibration, locks the droplet into a rocking motion, more or less back and forth, but nothing is happening. It does not slide down or it does not climb up. Also, another point to notice here is that if we switch off the topography, the droplet will move downstream, and B, notice this hysteresis, for example, here when at the end of the half of the period of the oscillation, when the contact lines are pinned, there is a difference between the two apparent contact angles. So again, we have a hysteresis-like effect. What we are going to do now is keep all the parameters the same. Everything is the same except we reduce the roughness. We just decrease the amplitude of the substrate. Not only the droplet does not slide downstream, but in fact it seems to exhibit a relatively rapid motion upstream, which is also accompanied by these stick slip events, as you can see here, okay? And also this kind of relaxation oscillations for the droplet radius, which is denoted here. Okay, is there any feature about this problem? Okay, so let me just now, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I just want to sketch some ideas. So we are focusing, let's go back to the dynamics of the moving contact line problem. And in fact, a number of people now work on this problem. I should mention Ben Goddard, Andreas Noll, Nico Sava, David Simpley, and Peter Yatchishin. This is a problem that has received considerable attention over the years, for many decades, in fact. And nevertheless, there are still a lot of open questions and points. So one could say that this is, in fact, an open problem in fluid mechanics. At the same time, it's also a controversial problem. Here is, for example, one controversy, what my good friend and former colleague Mike Savage from this university calls the Serro paradox. Serro was a postdoc of Scriven. Some of you might know the Hugh and Scriven solution for the outer region in the Stokes law regime of the contact line problem. So what he said is something very simple, and Mike can correct me if I'm wrong. let's try to test experimentally this solution. And he couldn't. And this is published work, and the experiments are repeatable. Let's talk about the sleep model that we actually used, okay? Now, of course, for our droplet spreading prototype, it did resolve some of the, if you like, at least qualitatively, some of the main features of the spreading dynamics, for example, the stick slip events and the hysteresis events. It did the job it was supposed to do, like the kinematic discontinuity was resolved, okay? And in fact, it alleviated the singularity associated with the moving contact line, okay? Without the sleep model, the stress will be infinite and the pressure will be infinite. But with the sleep model, the stress becomes finite and the pressure has an integrable singularity, goes like log r as r tends to 0, suggesting that we have a finite force. Still, from a physical point of view, one should worry when the pressure in a fluid tends towards minus infinity, albeit slowly as the contact point is approached. Is that the only model? No, not surprisingly. There is a plethora of such models. And, well, some of them are more popular than others. And what we have done, in fact, with Nico, this is a paper that will appear soon, we have actually looked at the most popular models asymptotically and numerically, and we developed conditions under which these models yield the same dynamics. I'm saying this because most people in the field would actually say that it does not really matter which model you use. So in our view, this is an important study. But what I think why there is a problem, why there is a controversy here, if you like, is because of a simple, if you like, physical fact. The fact that the interface, or any interface, is a mesoscopic boundary in the sense that any material property at a macroscopic distance from an interface varies smoothly, while as we approach the interface, especially at a very small scale, let's say intermolecular scale, we have steep gradients, for example, for the density in a direction perpendicular to the interface. So we have interfacial processes, if you like, which are affected by microscopic factors, yes, on the one hand, and also we have, which are beyond, of course, the conventional hydrodynamics, okay? And on the other hand, we cannot use something like molecular dynamics or similar methodologies because both the number of particles involved and the characteristic scales that have to be resolved are sufficiently large. But perhaps a middle ground between the two could be achieved, okay? This is easier said than done. And this could be, for example, mesoscopic continuum theories in which one introduces intermolecular forces into coarse-grained equations of motion. I refer to the so-called dynamic density functional theory, or DDFT, from the statistical mechanics of liquids community. Okay, so I'm just going to sketch some of ideas here. In the simplest version, and there is a nice paper by Marconi and Tarazona discussing this, DDFT says that the gradient of a conserved parameter, like, for example, the density, is given by the gradient of a flux with a diffusional part proportional to the gradient of a free energy function. This is, in fact, the chemical potential mu. So if we have a fluid in an unbounded domain, yes, and we set mu to be less than the saturation value of the chemical potential, yes, it turns out that the preferred state, the more stable state, is the bulk gas, yes? But if you now bring into this system an attractive wall, it will have a repulsive and attractive part, but it will also have the attractive part is what makes the difference. You can actually stabilize a thin film in the immediate vicinity of the wall. And then one can look at the bifurcation paragraph for this parameter here, gamma. It's a measure of the mass, if you like, of the system in the immediate vicinity of the wall. Rho here is some type of density of the fluid. So Z equals 0 is the location of the wall. Also, this can be viewed as a measure of the film thickness. So if we look at gamma versus delta mu, which is the difference of mu from the saturation value of the chemical potential, we get this type of this S-type curve, where you have three branches, a stable one indicated with blue and blue here, two stable ones, and an unstable one indicated with green here. In fact, this is in fact done simultaneously. This computation is in fact live right now. If you take this initial condition, that is you perturb an unstable state downwards with the red here, okay, the system is going to end up to the lower stable branch. Well, if you do the opposite, that is if you perturb the system upwards, it's going to end up to the upper stable branch. Strictly speaking, the lower stable branch between this turning point and this point here, yes, is in fact metastable, and the same for the upper one between here and here is a metastable branch. So what we have done so far is to try to understand analytically and also numerically the behavior of existing DDFT formalisms. Ben Goddard, and we had an interesting discussion with Andy Akrivos today on this problem, has been trying to develop, to include flow into this DDFT formalism here, which at the moment is just a diffusion-like process. And in fact, we have some Navier-Stokes-like equations with extra terms due to non-local interactions, but we have to understand this a bit more. There is also something else interesting about this problem here in this diagram, that there exists precisely at this point a value of the chemical potential, yes, where a thin film is equally stable with a thick film, okay? And the two, in fact, coexist, okay? This is known as a first-order wetting transition, or a pre-wetting transition. And of course, there is an upper bound for this coexistence value of the chemical potential, which is the saturation value somewhere here, which then suggests if we tune the conditions so that the pre-wetting or the coexistence value of the chemical potential starts approaching saturation from below, we can just make the film thickness of the thicker film approach towards infinity. So then we could have a thin film coexisting with an almost infinite thick film, suggesting the possibility of being able to obtain a liquid wedge, yes, in the vicinity of the wall with a well-defined three-phase contact line. And this is just a computation, yes. This is a two-dimensional computation. These are level curves of the density field, okay, and these are measured in terms of intermolecular parameters, so intermolecular distances. So this wedge actually does exist, okay. Moreover, it seems to persist for distance sufficiently far from the wall. For example, this is about 30 molecular diameters, and hence it should be capable to actually enter the microscale. Okay, so we're working on this problem, how exactly this can be done. So notice also, precisely because the wall is attracted, there is always this thin film ahead of this contact point. So I will just leave it at this point. So I think I'm just going to close by saying a few thanks. Okay, this is our group, the most capable people that you can think of. This is Markus Smuk working with myself and Greg Pavliotis. I mentioned Greg, we have a very successful collaboration. He joined us from MIT. This is David Sibley, who joined us from Bath. Andreas Nold from Darmstadt. Sebastian Krumschild working with Greg and myself, a very capable student from Aachen. This is Raj from an IIT in India. Nico Sava also from MIT. Fabio Bozzoli from Italy, from Parma. We have been trying to do with Joao Capral some experiments to confirm the theory of Nikos. This is Ben Goddard, I mentioned earlier. He came from the Mathematics Institute of Warwick. Peter Yacinski from St. Petersburg, and last but not least, Mark Pradas. So I want to thank Katie Wicks because she organized this event to a great detail, and of course our own Alicia Lithko. Not to leave my wife Yolanda. I am always on an unstable manifold, so she helps me to stabilize myself. And last, I wanted to tell you that this is sort of like a small advertisement. The work that we have done on falling films with my friends and collaborators, Christian, I mentioned earlier, Benoit Said from Brussels, and Manuel Velarde from Madrid, is due to appear as a monograph from Springer Series on Applied Mathematical Sciences. This is due sometime in August. And it's a heavy duty, about 600 pages. However, it's a rigorous treatment of this subject. However, although it's a monograph, there are some interesting tutorials towards the end. For example, some of the computations we have done and so on, we give various details. So I think it would be interesting to look at this. Okay, so with that, I will close here.